All right, everyone. Welcome to another exciting episode of AWM Studios podcast right here. I'm joined in studio today with my good friend and the runner of my second channel, All Wrestling Madness, Sean. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, James.
Now, today's episode came from you, actually, and you said that you wanted to talk about WWE and pro wrestling in general. What in mind did you really have when it came to pro wrestling?
Oh, yeah. So this morning, I was watching Mike movie, but it mentioned Gorgeous George.
Yeah.
And I was like, I don't know who that is. I thought they were referencing George Foreman. So I'm like, you know what? Let me ask James.
Yeah.
Barry, let's see exactly who he was, and maybe he could tell me a little bit more about the intro, the start of wrestling. Pro wrestling as it was. Maybe you could show me a little bit more about that before WWE. Maybe even before WWF, or maybe the beginnings of that.
Yeah. You see, Gorgeous George was a wrestler from, I think, like the 30s and 40s of wrestling. He worked for Vince McMahon's grandfather, Jess McMahon, the original owner of the entire wrestling organization. Believe it or not, wrestling has always been run by a McMahon of some sort. So, what it is WWE, what we know as WWE in today's time, started all the way back in in the 1920s. And it was run by Jess McMahon, or Roderick McMahon he went by also. And it was known at the time as Capital Wrestling, I think it was Capital Wrestling Corporation. And over time, it became WWF, Worldwide Wrestling Federation, which was owned by Vince McMahon's father, Vince Sr. But to make a long story short, Gorgeous George was one of their top prizes. Like, he was like their version of Hulk Hogan, not in look, but just in like popularity. Like in the 1930s and 40s, he was their Hulk Hogan of their era. He was the star that everyone wanted to have. But back then, they were working under territories. So, like, Northeast would have, like, 2 or 3 different promotions. The Midwest would have, like, 3 or 4 different promotions. But they all only worked in their areas. They never intertwined or worked outside the areas like you do nowadays. But to make a long story short, that's basically who Gorgeous George was. He was, like, the Ric Flair or the Adrian Adonis, who later on in this podcast you'll also get to know the history of Adrian Adonis as well. But I'm getting a little off topic. Gorgeous George was their version of Hulk Hogan.
So who is Jesse McMahon as far as the Vince McMahon and Vince McMahon Sr.?
You see, Jess McMahon, or Jesse, or Roderick, whatever you want to call him, he went by many names. He was the original founder, I can't say of pro wrestling, because pro wrestling's been around for a long time, but more or less the entertaining pro wrestling aspect he's been the founder of. Him and Arnold Scotland, friggin' down the line in like the 70s and 80s, you had Gorilla Monsoon work with Vince McMahon Sr., but Jess was his father, was Vince McMahon Sr.'s father. And he was what started what eventually became WWE later on down the line in the lineage. Capital Wrestling Corporation was just like wrestling, boxing. It wasn't just wrestling. It was just a corporation that intertwined in almost any sport. They didn't go like baseball and football or all that, but I'm saying like fighting sports. So like boxing, kickboxing, whatever it was, he basically promoted. He was just a promoter, putting on shows here and there in the Northeast. He basically owned the Northeast. He ran through the Northeast. Like I said, there were other promotions out there in the Northeast. You had like 4 or 5 different small local promotions in different states. But the territory was run by one big guy, which was Jess McMahon, the grandfather of Vince McMahon. But, yeah. And then later on down the line, you had Vince McMahon Sr. take over from his father, renaming the company the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, and later on just dropping the wide part and naming it World Wrestling Federation. And fun fact, or I mean, I wouldn't say it's fun. I apologize for the wrong terminology. But fact nonetheless, fact, upon his deathbed, he made his son, Vince McMahon, the one that we all know in today's modern time, his father made him promise him that if he gave him the company, not to compete with other promotions out there and putting them out of business. Just focus on your company. Do not focus on the neighbor's company or somewhere in like California or somewhere like that. Just focus on your company alone and just make it the biggest company you can for yourself. Not for the world, for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And Vince McMahon basically had his fingers crossed, I mean, metaphorically speaking, had his fingers crossed and basically said, sure, Dad, I'll make sure I don't ever go into business and put other people out of business. But what we all know down the line is that Vince McMahon was a liar.
He put a lot of people out of business, right?
He put almost everybody out of business. Everybody wanted his head on a stake because he literally cost them their livelihoods. He would go from New York or Connecticut, where he lived, he would go from New York, Connecticut, and get television deals in, let's say, Oklahoma, television deals in, like, Texas, television deals in, like, Arkansas, or something like that, like, outside of his territory.
Mm-hmm.
And he would put people out of business because they're getting television deals from the WWF. And that's what created the highest company out there, WWE, later on down the line, which I'll get to also why they had to change their name. But more or less, that's just a long story of where the company came from.
What was like a top fighter for Capital?
Capital.
Do you know any, or
not off the top of my head?
What years did it range from?
It ranged. Capital Wrestling was more or less 1930s through 1950s, really.
Hmm.
Like that 20-year gap.
And then when they had WWF, who was the top fighter?
That I can answer.
Mm-hmm.
When the WWF, Worldwide Wrestling Federation, started with Vince McMahon Sr., they had Buddy Rogers, which, if you are an old-timer, and you remember the early days, back when Vince's father ran it, Buddy Rogers was the original Nature Boy. He was the one who started that gimmick before Ric Flair ever had it. And he was the first incarnation of WWF World Champion. But sadly, due to health conditions and a heart attack that he had to drop the belt a month after being crowned champion. And he lost it to Bruno Sammartino, who was the greatest wrestler of all time, in my opinion. All time. Nobody to this day has held a title as long as he's held a title. He held it for about 2,803 days. Approximately, a little more, a little less. But he held on to it for quite some time. And to this day, check any record book. No matter what company it is, New Japan, Ring of Honor, WWE, WCW, no matter what company it is, check it out. Nobody, even New Japan, nobody has ever held a championship for that long.
Just pro wrestling, or?
Well, I'm talking, just strictly pro wrestling.
Pro wrestling.
I mean, I'm sure in UFC or boxing or whatever.
And this was during the WWF era?
Yeah, this was like the 50s and 60s, something like that.
Mm.
And Bruno Sammartino, no, I'm sorry, scratch that. It was the 60s and 70s. Bruno Sammartino was their Hulk Hogan, because every single time they would rent out Madison Square Garden, they would always put him in the main event and always put the belt on him, always have the belt on him, rather. And basically, yeah, he was the Hulk Hogan of their era. He was the biggest attraction. Anytime you wanted to fill Madison Square Garden to its brim, I mean to its brim. Let's just name a fake number. Madison Square Garden could hold 30,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to get at least 22, 25,000 people in there, always put Bruno Sammartino in the main event. Always. Whether you book him to win or lose, didn't matter. Just putting him in the main event at all guaranteed sell-out tickets. Now, back then, it was a different Madison Square Garden than what we are used to in today's society. So back then, it probably only held maybe 5,000, 10,000 at tops, but still, that 5,000, 10,000 was always there when Bruno Sammartino was in town.
That was probably a lot of people then, too.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. For a wrestling show back then, before television deals, yes. Because back then, they only had videotapes and, like, tape deals. So they didn't have, like, television networks that we all have in today's society.
How much would a ticket be, do you know?
I don't know the true value, but if I had to take a stab in the dark, I'd have to say somewhere like 40, 50. But then again, 40, 50 back then is like maybe 200, 300 now.
Yeah, sure.
About 300, 400 now. Because that was like top dollar.
Now, let me think. Oh, man.
You want to talk about the history of WWE's reign of Supreme?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, let's get into that. WWE's reign of Supreme started after Vince McMahon Sr. passed away. That we all know, that I already said.
When did he pass?
I think...
Is this like 20 years ago?
No, while ago.
34.
This was like, in like, maybe 78, 79. Somewhere in that area.
Okay, that's when he kind of passed down the torch.
Yeah. He sold the company to Vince Jr., which we all know as Vincent Kennedy McMahon on TV.
He sold it to Vince Jr.?
Yeah, he sold the company to his son.
For a decent price, or was it expensive?
It was a decent price. He gave his son a break.
I'm surprised he didn't just pass it down.
Nah, because his father saw that if you're going to be serious about running a company, you have to put something in it.
Oh,
you can't just be giving it like a spoiled, rotten rich kid and expect to be successful. You have to literally put every dollar in, because if you put money into it and you don't see a return, it forces you to fight even stronger to make it a successful brand, a successful product, a successful company, whatever it is. Oh. So, and that's what Vince Sr. saw in his son. He didn't want his son's money, probably. I don't know. But he only did that, in my opinion, because he saw that if you did that and you failed, at least you want to work stronger to make that money back.
Kind of show that he's more responsible and
exactly
that he wants to pay for. He wants to be a part of it, not just
exactly.
Oh, here you go. Here's a free company.
Exactly.
And then end up canning it.
Yeah. And like I said, here comes the history lesson for those that don't know, the younglings that may be watching this podcast. Basically, what ended up happening after his father passed, he was given the company, whatever. He went on, like I said, to get television deals outside of his territory, because back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, he worked in what was called territories, like I was explaining earlier on in the episode. Territories are like Northeast, Midwest, like down south had their own territory, like Florida Championship Wrestling, the original, not WWE's version, the original. You had all these different incarnations of everything, but they were all their own independent companies, and they were all working for themselves. They were all trading stars, working with stars, being respectful to each other. Vince McMahon, on the other hand, saw global phenomenon. I can make multi-millions if I just take my company here in New York and travel out to Oklahoma, travel out to California, travel down to Florida, doing all these different traveling events and taking over other people's territories. He saw dollar value, and saw going into not only dollar value, but he saw success, which I'll give him props. When you want something successful, you go for it. You step on anybody to get a successful product, company, whatever. Now, to make a story shorter, he did all that, and there was a small company at the time, about 80s, like early 80s, called Jim Crockett Promotions, that was running from late 70s to the early mid-80s. They went out of business, they folded, and TBS owner and founder Ted Turner ended up buying the company and calling it World Championship Wrestling, WCW. And he was like, you know what? I want to get into the wrestling business. And when Vince heard this from Ted himself during a meeting once, he said, hey, Vince, I'm getting into the wrestling business. So Vince was like, well, if you're getting into the wrestling business, I'm getting into the entertainment business. It's tomato, tomato. It's basically the same thing at the end of the day. It's just different terminologies, but it just sounds more professional when you're saying entertainment rather than wrestling. But he opened up his company, WCW, and in the early days, it was nothing. It was just a bullshit company, in my opinion. I didn't really like the entertainment value of it. Fast forward, 1992, late 92, mid to late 92, Vince McMahon was like, you know what? I want to start doing weekly shows on television. I want to really get my company out there. This is when he started brainstorming with him and his creative team for a show, which would eventually become Monday Night Raw. Now, Monday Night Raw debuted on television for the first time ever out of the Manhattan Center in New York City on January 11th, 2000 January 11th, 1993. And it was this attempt at doing a weekly show. Back then, WWF only ran shows like twice a month. And they only ran like certain shows. It wasn't like a full schedule like it is now. You only had maybe like, I don't know, like 4 or 5 shows during the whole year. Maybe 5 shows the whole year. But by the time 91, 92 came around, they started having like 7 or 8 shows a year, which opened up more of an horizon, more of a reason to do storyline based. Back then, they were only doing matches and matches. They weren't doing storyline really anything. Because they were only doing it like twice a month, if anything. So, right there, they didn't have much to work with. Except for like pay-per-views like Royal Rumble and WrestleMania. Like those had storyline-based shows. But, more or less, they really didn't have anything to work with. They were working with, I think it was called Titan Sports or something like that. They were working with, which was like their early incarnation of like anything storyline-based to try and work off of. To try and attract more viewers. But by 93, he started Monday Night Raw. And I'm going to be honest, if you go on Peacock right now, with your Peacock subscription, no, we are not sponsored, but we do suggest that you get Peacock, not just for WWE entertainment value, but for any other television shows or movies out there. So get Peacock, check it out, and if you get it, check out WWE's content in their library. And you can see the first ever episode of Monday Night Raw right there. Just go to Raw in the category, go to Season 1, because they're all in seasons. Go to Season 1 and go to the very first episode. In my opinion, it was alright. It was passable. Back then, from 93 to 95, they were doing 1 hour live, 1 hour pre-taped. So, basically, that's all they were doing was 1 hour live, 1 hour pre-tape because they would like film the other half of the show while they're doing the other half, so that the next week they would just swap out the episodes.
You know, off topic a little bit.
Go ahead.
So when Vince Sr. had it, what was he doing in order to commercialize his business? Was he sticking to one region, or was he somehow making commercials, making newspapers?
He was...
Or even, like, the video recording, because if you remember in 85 with, like, Mike Tyson's boxing videos, they weren't perfectly as far as the quality goes. So if you go 10 years prior, how is he commercializing this?
He was basically just doing what local street teams do. They were just putting up posters, local talent, word of mouth. Basically just that, like, because he was the guy who brought in Hulk Hogan, believe it or not, was his father. Vince Sr. brought him in.
What portion were they based out of?
What do you mean, like what state?
No, like you said, there was sections.
Yeah, the McMahons always ran out of the Northeast Territory back then, which comprised of states like New York, Connecticut, Maine, Massachusetts, basically anything northeast
Mhm.
was their entire territory where they could travel to. Mainly, they would only be traveling to Madison Square Garden, Shea Stadium at the time a few times.
They did it inside of Shea Stadium.
Yeah, the original incarnation, the original Shea Stadium. They did a couple of shows there. They did, for what I was led to believe by an unknown source. I don't know how true this is. That's why I'm taking it with a grain of salt.
Hmm.
I was told the old Shirley Bingo Hall, that's no longer there.
Used to be wrestling.
Used to be run a couple of times by WWF or WWF. And they brought in Andre the Giant there once or twice, which you saw the size of the building back when you went. I don't know how Andre the Giant could have entered that building. He was like 6'9", 6'10". I don't know how the hell he was able to even be there, let alone get in a ring. I know Riddick Bowe, we had him once for an ECPW, East Coast Pro Wrestling show.
Where was he?
He was a boxer.
No, I mean, where was he?
He worked the show. He was, we had him for 2 shows. Actually, I think it was 2 shows. I can be wrong. The first show he worked, no, it was only 1 show. He worked as a referee, which, unless you're trained in the world of wrestling, it was like so bullshit. Like, it's not even entertaining.
Oh, man.
And I can't even say that for Riddick's part. He wasn't trained.
Did he play a good part though? Did like everyone enjoy? It
was a slow, boring match, in my opinion.
Oh, did they enjoy having him there though?
I mean,
because he's a big.
I know he was a world champion at one point in boxing.
Yeah, he was a top dollar. He was I'm sure he was fighting everybody back then.
Hey guys, thanks again for watching. I'm so glad we actually got one out. It took a little while. The last 2 we did 2 podcasts, and both of them were lost in translation. This one we had some audio issues toward the end, so we cut off a good 15 minutes of conversation. But as you can see, Barry Wolf over here is doing so good, and we're definitely going to come back for more. We were going to keep talking and get that whole hour in, but we figured something was just going to go wrong, and luckily we took that thought. Something did go wrong, but overall we got quite a bit of conversation about the wrestling in the between somewhere in the 1900s, early 1900s to now, to some extent. So that was kind of nice. Then we had his conversation about Riddick Bowe and how he was a referee for a little while. You can actually check the video up on YouTube. You can see the whole thing. But yeah, I'm so glad to have Barry Wolf from AWM Studios come by and be able to make another podcast. Definitely enjoyed being able to do that. My next video with him, we're gonna have better audio quality. We're trying to get better equipment. I think that's like the main thing: better equipment, better audio quality. But thanks again for watching, everybody. Follow follow him at AWM Studios. Subscribe if you can, like if you can. Thanks again. If you guys want to see more videos like this, definitely give us a thumbs up, and we'll keep them coming. We always enjoy making these videos, so it just helps out. Also, my Robinhood and my Firstrade links, if you guys are interested in creating a portfolio, they will give you a free stock when you sign up. Thanks again for watching, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your week.